If there is one aircraft that changed the psychological balance of an entire war, it was not the biggest, not the most heavily armed, and not the most technologically overwhelming on paper. It was the Supermarine Spitfire, an aircraft born in peacetime Britain, designed without knowing it would soon be tested against the most powerful air force Europe had ever seen. When it first appeared, few could have predicted that this elegant, almost fragile-looking fighter would become the difference between national survival and total defeat. Yet within just a few years, the Spitfire would be fighting over cities, seas, deserts, and mountains, constantly evolving, constantly adapting, and refusing to become obsolete even as technology advanced at a brutal pace. What made the Spitfire truly shocking was not just its performance, but the timing of its arrival. Britain entered the late 1930s with outdated aircraft, shrinking military budgets, and a public deeply scarred by the memory of the First World War. The idea of another large-scale conflict was something many believed simply could not happen again. Meanwhile, across the Channel, Germany was rearming at a speed that stunned foreign observers. Modern fighters, aggressive doctrine, and mass production were reshaping warfare. Against this backdrop, the Spitfire was not merely another aircraft project. It was a gamble. If it failed, there would be no second chance. Designed by Reginald J. Mitchell, a man already suffering from the illness that would soon take his life, the Spitfire carried an almost tragic urgency within its metal skin. Mitchell pushed aerodynamic limits that many engineers considered unnecessary or even risky. The elliptical wing, now famous, was not chosen for beauty. It was chosen because it offered the lowest possible drag for the highest possible speed, while still allowing heavy armament. At a time when most fighters were compromises, the Spitfire was designed with one brutal assumption. It would have to fight and win against a technologically advanced enemy, outnumbered and under constant pressure. Early test flights revealed both promise and danger. The aircraft was fast, responsive, and unlike anything the Royal Air Force had flown before. But it was also unforgiving. Pilots transitioning from older aircraft found it demanding, especially on the ground. Landing accidents were common, visibility was limited, maintenance crews struggled with its tight tolerances. There were serious voices within the system questioning whether Britain could afford such a complex machine when war seemed increasingly inevitable. Simpler aircraft, cheaper aircraft, easier aircraft all had their supporters. The Spitfire survived these doubts by the narrowest of margins. Then war came, and with it, the ultimate test. When German aircraft crossed into contested skies, the Spitfire was no longer an experimental marvel or a production challenge. It became a frontline weapon. What followed was not instant dominance, but something far more important: balance. For the first time, German pilots encountered a British fighter that could meet them on equal terms. It could climb with them, turn with them, and in the hands of a skilled pilot, outfight them. This alone shattered a dangerous myth that German air superiority was inevitable. Yet even at this stage, the Spitfire was far from perfect. It lacked range, it demanded constant maintenance, it was expensive to produce, and perhaps most shockingly, it was never intended to carry the entire burden of Britain's air defense alone. Its role was specific, almost surgical, but history would soon force it into roles far beyond what its designer ever imagined. Roles that would push its structure, its engines, and its pilots to the edge of what was humanly and mechanically possible. This is where the real story of the Supermarine Spitfire begins. Not as a symbol, not as a legend, but as a machine forced into continuous evolution by the relentless pressure of war. What it became over the next years would redefine fighter aircraft design forever. The first true shock came not from victory, but from survival. When the Spitfire entered large-scale combat, it did not sweep the skies clean or crush the enemy with ease. Instead, it found itself locked in a brutal contest where every advantage was measured in seconds, meters, and pilot endurance. The skies over Britain became a grinding arena of attrition. German formations arrived in disciplined waves, confident, aggressive, and numerically superior. British pilots scrambled repeatedly each day, often with barely enough time to refuel, rearm, and catch their breath before being sent back up. In this environment, the Spitfire revealed its most important quality. It could keep fighting when everything else was breaking down. Pilots quickly realized that this aircraft gave them something rare in modern air combat: choice. In a dogfight, the Spitfire could turn tighter than its main opponent, the Messerschmitt Bf-109. That single advantage changed how battles unfolded. German pilots, trained for short, decisive engagements, suddenly found themselves dragged into turning fights they had not planned for. The Spitfire did not always win these encounters, but it denied the enemy certainty. In aerial warfare, uncertainty is deadly. A fighter that forces hesitation can be as powerful as one that delivers overwhelming firepower. At the same time, the Spitfire exposed the limits of British preparation. Engines overheated, ammunition jams occurred at critical moments. Early armament configurations, relying heavily on rifle-caliber machine guns, sometimes failed to bring down enemy aircraft quickly enough. Pilots reported seeing rounds strike enemy planes without immediate effect, forcing them to stay in combat longer than was safe. Losses mounted, not just from enemy fire, but from exhaustion and mechanical strain. The Spitfire was not a miracle weapon, it was a lifeline, and lifelines fray under constant pressure. What made this phase especially shocking was how close Britain came to losing control of its air defense system entirely. Radar stations were targeted, airfields bombed, pilots killed faster than they could be replaced. The Spitfire was often introduced into combat in small numbers, sometimes too few to decisively alter an engagement. Yet again and again it prevented collapse. Even when outnumbered, even when damaged, it bought time. Time for pilots to learn. Time for tactics to adapt. Time for production lines to accelerate. Behind the scenes, engineers were already fighting a parallel war. Every combat report fed directly back into development. Wing structures were reinforced. Gun heating systems were modified to prevent freezing at altitude. Engine tuning was pushed beyond conservative limits, extracting more power at the cost of reduced lifespan. This was an unspoken reality. Many Spitfire engines were never meant to last long. They were built to win today, not survive tomorrow. The aircraft became a consumable weapon in the truest sense, balanced on the edge between performance and failure. Perhaps the most unsettling realization came when commanders understood that the Spitfire's greatest strength, its agility, was also tying it to defensive warfare. It was superb at protecting home skies, but poorly suited for long-range escort missions. As the war expanded beyond Britain, this limitation would become impossible to ignore. The aircraft that had saved the nation was suddenly at risk of being left behind by the changing demands of the conflict. And yet, instead of fading into irrelevance, the Spitfire did something no one fully anticipated. It adapted again. That adaptation, driven by necessity and desperation, would transform the Spitfire from a defensive shield into a global weapon, one that would fight on every front, in every climate, against every major enemy aircraft of the war. What followed was not a redesign, but a quiet escalation. The Spitfire did not suddenly become a new aircraft overnight. Instead, it was reshaped piece by piece under the pressure of necessity. The heart of this transformation was the engine. Early versions relied on the Rolls-Royce Merlin, a power plant that was already impressive, but soon pushed far beyond its original limits. Engineers increased boost pressure, refined superchargers, and accepted shorter engine life in exchange for higher altitude performance. This decision was dangerous and controversial. Engines failed more often. Maintenance demands increased, but the payoff was enormous. Each incremental gain in altitude and speed shifted the balance back in Britain's favor. As enemy aircraft improved, the Spitfire followed relentlessly. German fighters gained better climb rates and heavier armament. The response was not to abandon the Spitfire, but to harden it. Armament evolved from rifle-caliber machine guns to combinations of cannons and heavy machine guns. This change was not smooth. Cannons jammed, recoil affected accuracy, and early installations disrupted airflow. Pilots complained, ground crews struggled. Yet once refined, the new weapons transformed the Spitfire from a deterrent into a decisive killer. Enemy aircraft could now be destroyed in seconds rather than minutes, reducing exposure and pilot fatigue. What made this phase particularly unsettling was how experimental frontline combat became. New variants were often sent into battle with minimal testing. Pilots were effectively test subjects, discovering flaws and strengths in real time. Reports of wing failures at high speed, control stiffening in dives, and sudden engine cutouts circulated through squadrons. And still, the aircraft flew. Still, it fought. There was an unspoken understanding that perfection was no longer the goal. Survival was. As the war expanded beyond Europe, the Spitfire faced environments it had never been designed for. In North Africa, sand infiltrated engines and weapons. In the Mediterranean, long overwater flights exposed weaknesses in navigation and range. In the Far East, heat and humidity punished both airframes and crews. Each deployment revealed new limitations. Each limitation forced another modification. Filters were added, wings were clipped or extended, fuel capacity was increased, sometimes at the cost of agility. The Spitfire began to fragment into dozens of specialized versions, each tailored for a specific role or theater. This fragmentation was both a strength and a warning sign. On one hand, it allowed the Spitfire to remain relevant everywhere. On the other, it revealed how thin the margins had become. There was no single perfect Spitfire anymore. There were only compromises. Speed versus range, firepower versus maneuverability, durability versus performance. The aircraft's identity was no longer defined by elegance alone, but by adaptability under extreme pressure. Then came the next escalation. Enemy aircraft grew faster, heavier, and more heavily armed. The Merlin engine, despite all improvements, was nearing its practical limit. At this point, many expected the Spitfire to finally step aside for newer designs. Instead, it underwent its most radical transformation yet. A new engine, more powerful and more demanding, was introduced. This change altered the aircraft's balance, handling, and personality. Pilots described it as familiar yet dangerous, faster yet less forgiving. The Spitfire was no longer just a dogfighter, it was becoming something else entirely. By this stage, the aircraft had outlived nearly all of its original contemporaries. Fighters that once seemed dominant had vanished from the front lines. The Spitfire remained, not because it was perfect, but because it could still be improved. That fact alone is what makes its story so unsettling. Most machines reach a point where further refinement becomes impossible. The Spitfire refused to accept that limit. But this relentless evolution came at a cost. The aircraft was now being asked to do things it had never been intended to do. High-speed interception, ground attack, reconnaissance, even naval operations. Each new role stretched its structure and its pilots closer to failure. The question was no longer whether the Spitfire could fight. It was whether it could survive its own success. The moment the Spitfire reached its peak was also the moment it became most dangerous to fly. With the introduction of the more powerful Griffin engine, the aircraft crossed an invisible threshold. Power output surged dramatically, transforming the Spitfire into a machine that could outclimb and outrun many of its opponents. But this power came with consequences. Torque on takeoff was violent. Mishandled throttle inputs could flip the aircraft before it even left the ground. Pilots transitioning from earlier versions often underestimated this change, sometimes with fatal results. The Spitfire had evolved from a responsive fighter into a weapon that demanded absolute discipline. In the air, the difference was unmistakable. Acceleration was brutal. Climb rates were astonishing. High-speed dives that once risked structural failure were now routine. Yet control forces increased sharply at high speeds and mistakes were punished instantly. The Spitfire no longer forgave hesitation or poor judgment. Veteran pilots respected it. Inexperienced ones feared it. This duality defined its final wartime form. It was no longer simply a defender or interceptor. It was a predator. At the same time, the human cost of sustained combat became impossible to ignore. Many Spitfire pilots flew multiple sorties per day for months on end. Fatigue dulled reflexes. Familiar airfields became targets. Losses were not always dramatic dogfights, but sudden, unceremonious events. Engine failures on climb-out, flak strikes during low-level attacks, mid-air collisions in crowded skies. The Spitfire's reputation as a heroic symbol masked a far harsher reality. For every triumphant engagement, there were quiet losses that never made headlines. Despite this, the aircraft continued to expand its roles. Reconnaissance variants stripped of weapons flew deep into enemy territory, relying solely on speed and altitude for survival. These missions were among the most psychologically demanding of the war. Pilots flew alone, unarmed, knowing that interception meant certain death. Yet the Spitfire's performance made these missions possible. It gathered intelligence that shaped entire campaigns, often without a single shot being fired. The aircraft also moved closer to the ground, taking on strike and ground attack missions. This was a dangerous evolution. The Spitfire was fast, but it was not built for sustained low-level punishment. Anti-aircraft fire tore into wings and fuselages, radiators were vulnerable, engines failed after taking minor damage. Still, the aircraft delivered. Its presence over battlefields disrupted enemy movements, destroyed supply lines, and forced ground forces to operate under constant threat. It was not ideal for this role, but it was effective enough to justify the risk. What makes this phase particularly unsettling is how normalized these extremes became. Engineers accepted shorter airframe lifespans, pilots accepted escalating risk, commanders accepted losses that would have been unthinkable earlier in the war. The Spitfire was no longer a rare or fragile asset. It was a workhorse pushed to its absolute limits, day after day. Its survival depended less on design elegance and more on relentless maintenance, pilot skill, and sheer luck. By the final years of the war, the Spitfire was everywhere and nowhere dominant. Jet aircraft were emerging. New designs promised higher speeds and entirely different combat doctrines. Yet the Spitfire remained on the front lines, still capable, still lethal. It had outlasted the war's assumptions about progress. It proved that evolution, not replacement, could sometimes be the more powerful path. But victory did not mean permanence. When the war ended, the world changed faster than the Spitfire could. The question shifted again. Not whether it could fight, but whether it still had a place in a world racing toward jets and missiles. When the war ended, the silence that followed was almost as shocking as the noise that had come before. For the Supermarine Spitfire, victory did not bring celebration or rest, it brought uncertainty. Thousands of aircraft that had once been desperately needed were suddenly surplus. Airfields that had operated at maximum capacity now stood half-empty. Pilots returned home, and the machine that had defined their lives was quietly pushed aside. In a world rushing toward jet propulsion, the Spitfire, despite all its evolution, was already being labeled a relic. Yet the aircraft refused to disappear. Instead of vanishing, it scattered across the globe. Nations that had fought alongside Britain, and even some that had not, adopted the Spitfire into their post-war air forces. It served in Europe, the Middle East, Asia, and beyond. In some regions, it became the backbone of air defense well into the late 1940s and early 1950s. This was not because it was the most modern aircraft available, but because it was reliable, well understood, and brutally effective in trained hands. For countries rebuilding after devastation, the Spitfire represented immediate capability without years of development. In these post-war years, the aircraft took on a quieter, less glamorous role. Patrols replaced dogfights. Training flights replaced combat sorties. Pilots who had once flown in life-or-death conditions now taught new generations how to handle high-performance aircraft. Ironically, this revealed just how demanding the Spitfire still was. Even without enemy pressure, it punished carelessness. Accidents continued. Ground handling remained difficult. The aircraft still demanded respect, even in peace. At the same time, jet aircraft were rewriting the rules of flight. Speed records shattered previous limits. Combat doctrine shifted almost overnight. Against this backdrop, the Spitfire's final operational years felt strangely out of place. It was a machine perfected for a type of war that no longer existed. One by one, air forces retired it. Some aircraft were scrapped. Others were sold cheaply to private owners. Many were simply abandoned, left to decay on remote airfields, their significance barely acknowledged at the time. What followed was something no designer, pilot, or commander could have predicted: resurrection. Aviation enthusiasts, historians, and former pilots began to recognize what was being lost. Restoration projects emerged, often costing more than the aircraft had ever been worth in wartime accounting. Original drawings were rediscovered, parts were reverse-engineered, entire engines were rebuilt by hand. The Spitfire transformed again, this time from weapon to artifact. Today, the aircraft exists in a state that is both preserved and fragile. Only a small number remain airworthy, and every flight is a calculated risk. These machines no longer train pilots or defend borders. They serve as living reminders of a time when engineering decisions were made under existential pressure. When one takes to the air now, it does so surrounded by silence rather than sirens, admired rather than feared. What is most unsettling about the Spitfire's legacy is not its victories, but its endurance. It survived not because it was invincible, but because it was adaptable. It absorbed lessons written in blood, metal, and fire, and carried them forward. Few machines in history can claim that. Fewer still continue to fly decades after their purpose has vanished. This brings the story full circle. The Supermarine Spitfire was never meant to be timeless. It was meant to win a war. That it became a symbol afterward is almost accidental. Its true achievement lies in something far more unsettling. It proved that survival, under the right balance of design and determination, can outlast even the era that created it. The Supermarine Spitfire story concludes not with a battle, but with reverence. Its achievements are staggering. It dominated the skies during the Battle of Britain, reshaped aerial combat tactics, and forced enemy planners to constantly adapt. Pilots credited it with saving their lives, giving them the speed, agility, and resilience needed to survive dogfights that would have destroyed lesser machines. Its Rolls-Royce Merlin and later Griffin engines pushed aeronautical engineering to new limits, while its elliptical wings became a symbol of aerodynamic perfection. Every detail, from armament to cockpit layout, was scrutinized, modified, and optimized under the pressures of war, producing an aircraft that could respond instantly to the pilot's instincts, often making the difference between life and death. Yet, alongside its triumphs, the Spitfire's story is a testament to human cost and the relentless demands of warfare. Pilots flew exhausted, maintenance crews worked tirelessly, and many aircraft were lost not to enemy fire, but to the unforgiving combination of human error and mechanical extremes. Its limitations, fragility under sustained low-level attack, sensitivity to torque, and vulnerability to faster, heavier aircraft served as constant reminders that no design is perfect. The Spitfire, for all its elegance and lethality, remained a machine bound by physics, engineering, and circumstance. After the war, its legacy took a different shape. Spitfires were exported worldwide, serving in Europe, Africa, and Asia, often in nations rebuilding their air forces from scratch. It trained new generations of pilots, bridged the gap between piston-driven fighters and the jet age, and inspired an entirely new appreciation for aviation history. Museums and private collectors painstakingly restored surviving aircraft, returning them to the skies as living monuments to courage, skill, and ingenuity. Each airshow flight, each careful takeoff and landing, evokes the tension, excitement, and danger that defined its original service. Today, the Spitfire lives as more than a machine. It is a symbol, a reminder of innovation under pressure, the razor's edge of survival, and the human spirit that bends but rarely breaks under the weight of conflict. Its wings continue to cut through the air, decades after its first flight, not as weapons, but as lessons. They teach awe, respect, and the sobering truth that every advance in technology carries both promise and peril. The Spitfire's story is, in every sense, a history of extremes: brilliance and danger, survival and sacrifice, power and vulnerability. It remains in museums across the world, from the Imperial War Museum in London to the Royal Air Force Museum in Cosford, with airworthy examples in the United Kingdom, the United States, and Australia. Some still soar in commemorative displays, while others rest in silent tribute, their polished surfaces reflecting the history they survived. For enthusiasts, historians, and former pilots, the Spitfire is not just an aircraft, it is a living memory, an icon of aerial warfare, and a reminder of what can be achieved when human ingenuity confronts the chaos of conflict. It is proof that some machines, forged in necessity, can transcend their original purpose and endure as legends.